A skeptic is hard to convince of anything, and we should be. We ought to be asking all of the hard questions and expecting rational, evidence based answers. In fact, everyone should be. But the religious don't, because they're just not that bright, are they? I guess we have to show them how to do it, though, right? So let's get on that coming up next. Let's do some more Randal Rauser. I've got a couple of his videos in the queue, so we really need to get out and cover them. I really do like Randal. I think he's on the road towards atheism, or at the very least, towards being much more critical of Christianity, which I think is a very good thing. Once you start questioning the religion, it's really hard to keep taking it seriously. But today, he's going to ask us if a particular miracle would or should convince us. I'm going to say no up front, although I don't know what he's going to produce, so I really don't know. I just know that no supposed miracle ever presented by the religious has ever been remotely convincing, at least to me. But hey, I'm willing to take a look. How about you? So here we go. Let's have it, Randal.
I want to talk about the concept of a miracle and present an idea to you, a case study, a hypothetical scenario to see whether you, if you were a skeptic, whether that would persuade you or at least move the needle toward believing that God exists or that Christianity is true.
That's not really what I expected this to be, but sure, whatever. I'm game. In other videos that he's done, he's gone after existing apologist content and been very critical of it, so that's kind of what I was assuming he was going to do here, but hey, I like being taken by surprise occasionally, so let's do this. Now, I'm going to be very upfront and say that here's something that you can't understand, therefore God done it, is never going to work on me. If he tries that, he fails immediately. God is not the automatic answer to any question for which you do not have an immediate, emotionally comforting solution. I don't know is always going to win out. This is where we see the religious having problems so often because they think God done it is the automatic go-to, and is just not. The only way to get to God done it is to prove that God exists first in some demonstrable and evidence-based way, and to prove that God actually done the thing that you're trying to get to. You are not going to have that, and I don't expect him to. I'm just going to say that right now. You just won't have it because such things simply don't exist. Not that they can't, but that they don't. And if they did, we'd have seen it by now because the religious would have been screaming it from the mountaintops. But they have to rely on these stupid religious arguments, so we know they've got nothing. So about as close as I might be able to give him is if he can present something so beyond anything that we have any experience with, and then my answer is just going to be, I don't know, because you haven't actually proven your God, or any God, is actually real or responsible for whatever it is you're claiming. So let's go into this with realistic expectations, which is something I would hope that Randal was doing. But since we haven't seen it, we just don't know. So let's get back to Randal. What do you have for us?
So, first of all, let's talk about the concept of a miracle itself. Though there's a lot of misunderstanding on the concept of a miracle. And when I talk about the concept of a miracle, I'm specifically talking about the Judeo-Christian tradition rooted in the Old and New Testaments.
But that's the thing. You haven't shown that any of those traditions actually mean anything. My book says a thing is completely irrelevant. The definition of a miracle in general is a surprising and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is therefore considered to be the work of a divine agency. I'm fine with the first half, but I am never going to go with the last half because gods are not automatic explanations for stuff that we just don't understand. The answer is always going to be, we don't know, at least until you can prove to our satisfaction that a God, any God, is demonstrably real, and we all know that they're not even trying. This is why all of these miracle claims fail, because they're just assuming things that they cannot justify by evidence. They just really want it to be true. And I'm sorry, but faith isn't remotely in my rational vocabulary, and it never will be. You can't get to God as a rational candidate explanation until you can show some really good reason to think that gods are even possible, much less actually exist. And as I said, they're not even trying to do that. If something weird happened, the most rational explanation is that it's a natural event that we simply do not understand yet. There's no reason to leap to a god. So hopefully he'll have an answer to that beyond have faith, because my answer is always going to be no.
The common conception that people often have is that a miracle is somehow a violation of natural law or an event with no natural causal explanation.
Which is basically the dictionary definition that I provided. I'm fine with that explanation, at least the first half, but we'll just go with it for shits and giggles. That doesn't make miracles supernatural, though. People will say that a child is a miracle, but let's be honest, their parents still fucked. It's a perfectly natural thing that the overly emotional attach a label to that really has no intelligent meaning. It just sounds good to them. That's why I'm holding to the title of his video, which is, "Would this miracle convince you that God exists?" And I'm almost certainly going to say no, not because I'm biased against any rational conclusion, but because I can't even imagine how they would even get me there. Because I'm not about to just attach comforting names to things that I just really want to be true. That is not how rational people operate. A thing is either true or it's not true. And the only way to get to that truth is to examine the evidence for that thing and come to the most rationally derived conclusion based upon it. My feelings mean absolutely nothing, and neither do yours. And this is where I figure he's going to go wrong. Let's see if I'm right.
But that is, I would say, neither necessary nor sufficient for a miracle. The core idea of a miracle. So there are a couple of Greek words, semeion and dunamis. So semeion is sign and dunamis is power. And together, I think that gives you a sense of really the biblical and New Testament and root Christian understanding of the concept of a miracle.
But that assumes things that are simply not in evidence. I don't care about a Christian understanding. I care about reality. That's why I gave the definition that I did, and unless he gives me a good reason to consider other alternatives, that's what I'm going to stick with. If you just redefine a miracle as something that you personally think is cool or whatever, so what? You're still nowhere close to getting to a god. I'm willing to give him a chance to change my mind, but this really comes off like what we see from a lot of other apologists all the time. Just a series of word games designed to get people to where they really want you to be, and that's never going to work on me. I don't think that Randal is that kind of person, although, granted, I could be wrong. So let's get back and see.
Where a miracle is a sign of God's action and of God's power.
You haven't shown that either of those are reasonable inferences in the first place. Again, God done it tends to be the automatic go-to for anything that the religious don't understand or don't like, and that is not going to work on me. I care what's actually true. I care what's actually demonstrably true. Not what is comforting or what gets you to the answer that you really feel good about. None of those things matter. I don't care about feeling good. I'm perfectly fine with, I don't know. It's going to take something really special to get me over the hump to any gods, and that is going to have to include demonstrable evidence, which anyone can examine without having to believe in things first. And let's be honest, we all know Randal simply doesn't have any of that because no theist in the history of forever ever has. If you see something that you do not understand, that doesn't mean God done it. It just doesn't.
but not necessarily one that involves God intervening in natural events and somehow, let alone violating a natural law or providing an event with no natural causal explanation to it.
But you're still just assuming that God exists in the first place, which is not in line with the verifiable facts. I've said this before, but if you ever watch a debate on does God exist, you will see that the theist invariably never argues for that in any worthwhile way. They just assume it. They can't demonstrate it. It's all, it sounds good to me. But that's not a debate, that's an assertion. And I don't care about your assertions. I care about your facts. And sadly for the religious, they simply don't have any. So, as much as I like Randal, I am not going to let him off the hook. He asked a very specific question, and that carried with it very specific requirements. And I don't think for 1 second that he'll be able to meet them, but let's get back and find out.
What this means is that, in principle, a miracle could have a perfectly natural explanation. Nonetheless, because of the context in which it occurs, it becomes a sign, it becomes significant, it becomes meaningful, and as a sign of God's divine action and perhaps a message that he's conveying to the individual, it becomes a miracle.
But you can't prove that. That's the problem. You are loading in your own theology into something that is entirely evidence based. How do you actually get there? Walk us through the steps. I mean, you can see the thing, it's right there, the event happened, but how do you get to the meaning that you're inserting into the event? This is exactly why religious testimony means absolutely nothing. This thing happened to me, and that means God done it. Sorry, but you're going to have to be able to prove that that conclusion is true. Just because you really like the idea doesn't mean anything, and that's what the religious testimony all comes down to. An unjustifiable claim attached to something which may or may not have happened as described. But the conclusion is never able to be demonstrated. You can't just get from shit happened to there's a God without a whole lot more evidence than you have. That's the problem. That's why testimony will never convince anyone, nor should it. I'm not questioning that something happened to you. I'm questioning the conclusions that you've drawn from it. I'm questioning how you ruled out other potential rational explanations before you just jumped to, God done it. Because as we all know, they never even try to do that. Because they just don't care.
So um, imagine, for example, you're walking through the woods and you see a rock floating in a lake. That would be odd. Perhaps that would even be a violation of natural law.
Or not. I mean, volcanic rock, otherwise known as pumice, that floats just fine. Or maybe there's something under the water that you just can't see that's holding up the rock and making it look like it's floating. That requires more investigation. You can't just leap to, God done it, which is what a lot of theists do. But let's just imagine that there really is a rock floating in the middle of a lake. What can we conclude from that? Well, let's just say we swim out there and grab the rock. It's a normal heavy rock like we see everywhere. We put it back in the water and it still floats. There's nothing under it to hold it up. We don't understand why it's doing that. We'd have to be able to investigate why that's happening. We might be able to do that and we might not. The fact that we can't doesn't make the event supernatural. It just means we don't know. There are all kinds of things that we just don't know. And that doesn't mean God done it. In order to get to God, you'd have to be able to demonstrate that God is a rational candidate explanation. And sorry, but you just haven't done that. In fact, I can't even think of a way that you could, given our current knowledge. God is never going to be a rational candidate explanation until you can find some way to suggest that any gods might potentially be real. And you're not even close to doing that. Get to work.
At least as we understand it. But it wouldn't be a miracle. Simple anomalous events that appear to violate natural laws we understand it, have no natural causal explanation, that in and of itself is not sufficient to make something a miracle.
Tell that to the religious wingnuts because they think that everything's a miracle. Finding their car keys is a miracle. That's one reason why I figure he should be asking all of these questions. And I don't know, he might be, but God done it without any evidence whatsoever in support is pretty much off the table because it isn't a rational position to take. It's an assertion, not a demonstrable fact, and you need it to be as close to a demonstrable fact as possible to even intellectually consider the possibility. Now, I don't know where he's going to go from here. We'll just have to watch along and find out. But right now, he's just not blowing smoke up my skirt. He's not showing me any reason to think that miracles exist at all, even hypothetically, or that any gods are possibly responsible. That's what he needs to do. So let's get back to Randal and see where this goes.
But let's say that man was saying he is a prophet, and you said, well, then show me you're a prophet, and he threw a rock onto the water and it floated.
That doesn't prove anything. Again, pumice floats. You can find all kinds of videos on YouTube with people walking on water because there's something just beneath the surface. This is not as impressive as you seem to think that it is. Magicians have been doing this crap forever, and it's only because most people tend to be gullible that any of it ever gets believed. Granted, that's exactly how religion works too. People are stupid and looking for reasons to believe, and the con man clergy are good at telling comforting stories and making unsupported claims such that people will just roll over and believe it because they're dumb. That doesn't make any of it magic, and it certainly doesn't make any of it true. Because even if this person does claim to be a prophet, that doesn't make their prophecy claim true. They could be lying. They could be delusional. Claims mean nothing until they are verified with evidence. And once again, we're back to square one because you can't prove that any gods actually exist. Claiming to be a prophet of a god that you can't show is real means nothing. So still no go, Randal. You need to be better than this.
Now there is an additional context so that the same action of the rock floating on the water becomes meaningful. It becomes a sign, a semeion of dunamis, a sign of power.
No, it doesn't. It's just something that you do not currently understand. That doesn't attach any other potential explanation to it whatsoever. Claims are claims, truth is truth. The only way to get from a claim to the truth is to provide the evidence necessary to demonstrate that it actually is true. And I bet your prophet wouldn't be able to do that, would he? Just because he says God gives him the power doesn't mean that God gives him the power, any more than the fact that David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty supposedly disappear means that God done it. You can't get from a thing to a god without being able to fill in all of the steps in the middle, and we all know they can't do that.
And in that case, it becomes a miracle.
No, it doesn't. It remains something that we do not understand, perhaps something that we cannot ever understand, but that doesn't mean that the empty claims made about the event are actually true. Now, I'm not a magician. I guess I kind of messed around with it when I was a kid, but I never took it all that seriously. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I was a great magician. I could fool people all over the place. If I did a card trick, the best card trick that had ever been done, that no one could ever explain how I'd done it, and I claimed that invisible, intangible, card trick granting pixies gave me the power to do it, that doesn't mean that the pixies exist. It just means that I said a thing, and that thing may or may not be true. The only way to find out if it's actually true is to examine the claim, and if no evidence can be found in support, then the claim itself can be dismissed because there's no reason at all to take it seriously. The same thing goes for your God. Just because you say your God is real, that doesn't make it so. That's something that religion really needs to figure out because it's never going to change.
While that could be a miracle, so something perhaps that seems to violate natural law or to have no natural causal explanation, again, it need not be the case that it is somehow in breach of natural law as we understand it.
Being a violation of natural law as we understand it doesn't make it a miracle. We learn new things all the time. When we started to understand quantum mechanics, that didn't make anything that quarks did miracles. It was just stuff that we needed to figure out. No gods required. That's how the nature of human knowledge has gone forever. We see something that we don't understand, the gullible rubes say, God done it. We research it and find out that it's a perfectly natural phenomenon. The gullible rubes were just wrong. Never once have we ever found any gods that were actually responsible for anything. It's all just nature. So why would we think that this rock-throwing prophet guy of yours is any different? We shouldn't, because we'd be foolish if we did.
But a miracle could be perfectly explained in terms of natural law, but nonetheless could compel a person as the most meaningful explanation being a divine sign.
But that's where you're going wrong. Compelling a person is not the same thing as the thing you say actually being correct. I don't care if dumb people believe it. I care if it's actually true. If you go watch old movies where the adventurers are exploring in deepest, darkest Africa or wherever, and they get captured by natives, but they get out of it because they had a lighter or they knew when the conveniently timed eclipse was going to happen, that doesn't make any of those things miracles, no matter what the natives might believe. It doesn't matter what anyone accepts. It matters what's actually true. This has been the kind of scam that the religious have been running forever. Tell a bunch of lies, soothe the gullible with comforting stories, and you can get them to hand over their money with hardly any effort. But that doesn't make any of it true. Your miracle stories don't mean anything unless you can demonstrate that they're actual miracles, performed by demonstrable gods, and Randal hasn't gotten anywhere close. No theist has. Why? Because they don't care about the truth, only about their own emotional comfort. I don't care what convinces anyone if their conviction isn't based on verifiable evidence. And so far, the religious have never demonstrated that it is, and that's the problem. That's why they're falling apart, and good riddance to them. He's just proving everything wrong with his own religion, whether he understands that or not. Now, maybe we'll come back next time and find that's what he was trying to do all along. I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. He might get to the very end and say, yep, I'm convinced miracles are bullshit. In fact, I hope that's what he does. So what do you hope? Let me hear down in the comments, because this is another video where he gets really, really close to the truth, and I'm hoping he doesn't just veer off into La La Land. But I guess we're going to have to wait until next week to see. And I hope you all join me then. Miracles are some of the most ridiculous things that the religious can point to because they can't actually show that they're miraculous. So they just tend to play fast and loose with definitions and pretend that they mean anything at all when clearly they don't. Will this get any better? I have no idea. I hope so, but let's check it out for ourselves. Let's check in with Randal Rauser and his miracle claims. Although, they're not really claims, are they? They're just made-up examples, at least so far. Let's just see if anyone is going to take them seriously, because, if you had to ask me right now, my answer would be no. Nobody with a brain should, and I don't suspect it's going to get any better from here, but hey, what do I know, right? So let's get right back into the action and see if he's got anything better for us to evaluate. Somehow, I doubt it, but hey, let's just go see, okay?
So I want to give you a scenario. Let me begin with a humorous anecdote. While browsing in a second-hand bookstore, George Bernard Shaw allegedly found a copy of one of his books, which he had once signed over years before to a friend.
That happens all the time. Not really meaning to break in a lot in the middle of his story, of course, but please indulge me. Authors know that most of the books that they sign, they are not going to be cherished by the person that they're signing them for, but they're going to be sold on eBay and similar places for a buck. It's why a lot of authors refuse to sign anything unless it's personalized to the person that they're signing for. That reduces prices because most people don't want a signed copy for somebody else. They want people to think that they had it signed themselves. And that sounds a lot like religion, doesn't it? Wanting personal benefits with absolutely no personal effort. So anyway, back to his story. I've already heard it, but for those of you who haven't, enjoy.
And he had written in the cover of the book to so-and-so, let's say to Jones, with esteem, George Bernard Shaw. As the story goes, Shaw purchased that book, that used book that he'd given to his friend years earlier, and he returned it to the friend, while adding a second inscription, with renewed esteem, George Bernard Shaw. Now that humorous anecdote, hopefully that gave you a little bit of a chuckle.
Not really. I mean, granted, we don't know the circumstances under which the event happened, but if Jones or whoever it was sold the book, then clearly they didn't care if they ever got it back again, except perhaps to sell it again for even more money. I don't know that you should really reward that, should you? If it was stolen or something, then sure, but the story doesn't go into that, does it? Catching someone doing it and rubbing their nose in it, though, that might be valuable, and I'd be completely fine with that. Granted, what I think doesn't matter. That's between George Bernard Shaw and Jones or whoever it was. I'm not all that concerned, except to say that this looks a lot like religion, doesn't it? All emotional comfort and not valuing demonstrable reality at all. Using it to get what you can get out of it, which is what a lot of theists do. That seems to be how most people treat religion. They don't take it all that seriously, it's just a means to an end. And they wonder why we roll our eyes at their stupidity. They shouldn't. They really shouldn't.
Provides me with a launching point to talk about a scenario. First of all, a scenario that I read as having occurred some years ago, around World War II and into the 1950s.
If this wasn't Randal, I would immediately think made-up story incoming, right? Now, I'm not saying that Randal can't do that, but I don't get that sense from him most of the time, and mostly these stories don't really mean anything regardless. So, at least for the sake of argument, and because it is Randal, I'm going to take his story as possibly true, even if it might be ultimately irrelevant, because so far, his miracle claim, if you remember from the last video, that's not going anywhere fast, is it? So, back to Randal's story, already in progress. Make it a good one, please.
Now, unfortunately, I don't recall where I read the story from. I read it in a book, and for all I know, it's not true.
And that's kind of why I like Randal. No other apologist out there would ever say that. They would never want their followers to think for a second that every word that comes out of their mouths isn't 100% perfect and true. And that's not the case. It's all part of the scam after all. So that's 10 points for Gryffindor or whatever, because we virtually never see this kind of stuff in apologetics. Good show, sir. Please continue.
The fact of whether it is true or not doesn't really matter. I'm going to share you that story as I remember it, the outline of it, and then I want to return and fill in the details of that story for my case study for discussion. So here's the story as I remember it. It's about an amazing coincidence. Some person could describe it even as what is sometimes called synchronicity, or what some people have colloquially referred to as God winks.
But that doesn't make those interpretations true. Coincidental things happen all the time. It doesn't mean that a god is responsible. Humans are, by our very nature, pattern-seeking creatures. We want to draw connections, even when those connections don't really exist. A lot of that is why people see miracles in everyday events. because they're desperate to make connections that aren't really there because they don't know and honestly don't care how the real world actually works. This is why I say that your interpretation means very little. That sounds like God to me doesn't mean anything. It matters not what you think is going on, only what you can demonstrate is actually going on. And most people, they don't bother to understand the difference, do they? They don't even bother to try. So once again, back to his story, which may not be true, and he admits that it doesn't matter. But we will listen to it anyhow because, hey, why not, right? We're already here. We got nothing better to do.
The story goes like this. It's a fellow, he had a book when he was a child, and I think he was like his mother, let's say, had given him this book for his birthday in World War II in England, and it was like, to my dearest Percival, happy birthday, Mum. And so then there was like a bombing of London or something. They had to escape very quickly. A lot of their belongings got left behind, including the book.
Let me guess. He found the book years later in New York or something, and now that's a miracle, right? Only God could have moved that book from World War II England to, say, 1980s America, wherever the story goes. But see, here's where that goes wrong. He presupposes God in the first place. There are many other possibilities. Maybe Odin did it. Maybe Ra did it. Hell, maybe aliens did it. You have not demonstrated that a god, any god, is a rational candidate explanation for the event. We might never know. Maybe shit just happens. Maybe there was another kid named Percival whose mother did the exact same thing, and that's the book that he found. Presumably because we're still in the middle of the story and we don't know how this turns out. We all know that memory is fallible and only as good as the last time that you recalled a particular event. The whole thing could all be imaginary for all anyone knows. So there's a lot of other explanations that are a lot more reasonable than, God done it. But let's see which one he goes for.
And like 20 years later, Percival had moved to North America and in fact was living in Indiana. And he walked into a bookstore, a used bookstore in Indiana, somewhere in the 1960s, and he saw a book just like the one that he had had as a child that his mother had given him. And that really stirred memories in him. So he picked it up off the shelf and he was going to purchase it. He opened it up, and on the inside cover, as you can imagine, uh, there was that inscription from his mother: "To my dearest Percival, happy birthday, love, Mom."
Okay, I was off on the location. Sue me, I don't watch this stuff up front. Yet everything else was accurate, right? Not that it was that hard to predict, because that's why he told the George Bernard Shaw story in the first place, because this is really the same story in essence. Now, we don't know if any of this ever happened at all, even Randal admits that, but the religious are well known for telling these just so stories because it gets them where they really want to go, or where they want their audience to go, without actually having any evidence to get there. Because we don't know the context of the story. He said it was in a book somewhere. We don't know where, so we have no way whatsoever to tell how reasonable such a story might actually be. Granted, he hasn't reached any conclusions on the story yet, so we can't say what he's trying to do. It doesn't get him anywhere remotely close to any gods, though, or any supernatural explanations at all. If it happened at all, and we don't know, then it's just a curiosity with no further conclusions that can be drawn. Stapling on other explanations because you really like the idea doesn't make those explanations valid or likely to be true. The best that anyone can say is, we don't know, which is something that the religious really hate to do. Because it makes them sad, and that's pathetic.
What are the odds of finding that book in that bookstore that years before, 20 years before, you'd had it halfway around the world in another country?
Unknown, because as I said, you haven't even proven that the story happened at all. And it was the same book that Percival's memories were accurate and all the rest of that. You have to do all of that first, and as Randal acknowledges, this could all just be a tall tale. He doesn't even remember where he got the story. So let's have some perspective. That's really the problem, isn't it? Not just with the religious, but with a lot of non-religious people too, who just leap to unwarranted conclusions because odd things just so happen in their lives. Well, God done it. Prove it. Prove God exists at all. Prove God was actually responsible. It doesn't matter what you believe, it matters what you can prove. And that's the problem with a lot of people, that they're more concerned with coming up with an explanation that they are happy with than it is coming up with an explanation that's actually true. It doesn't matter to them at all if the explanation is complete nonsense, so long as it fills in an emotional void in their desire to understand. So no, even if he was going to present this as a miracle, which I'm hoping he's not doing, but even if he was, it wouldn't be impressive either. All you'd have is an event without a ready explanation. That doesn't make it supernatural. It just makes it unknown.
What are the odds? Right? They blow the mind. It's an incredible coincidence. It's not yet a miracle, however.
It's not remotely close. For it to be a miracle, you'd have to demonstrate that a God done it. And you're not even trying. Because God isn't the automatic answer to any question that you do not have an immediate answer for. You actually have to get there rationally. But the religious have no interest in that at all, do they? They just really want to believe. So let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, that this story actually happened. I figure it probably didn't, but hey, what do I know, right? So you have a Christian and a Muslim and a Hindu who all heard the same story. The Christian says, God done it. And the Muslim says, Allah done it. And the Hindu says, Krishna done it. So who is right? Well, so far as we can tell, none of them, because there's no evidence whatsoever for any of those gods. There are two requirements to come to those conclusions rationally. First, you have to provide evidence that said gods exist in the first place, and that simply doesn't exist. But for the sake of argument, as I said, let's give them the benefit of the doubt for the moment and pretend that they can do that. Secondly, you have to show that those now real existing gods that you have supported with evidence, one or more of them, whatever, actually did the deed. Just because a god exists, that doesn't mean that he finds your car keys every morning. You have to have a demonstrable causal link between the real God that you've already got evidence for and the event in question, and the religious simply don't have that. None of them do. None of them even try. They just assume it, and that doesn't make it true. So once again, without that evidentially supported God that they don't have, without the demonstrable causal link that they don't have, you're right back to we don't know. And that's possibly all you'll ever have. Things don't become miracles until you can prove that they're miracles. So no, I am not remotely impressed.
And it's not yet a miracle, I would submit, in the same way that just finding a rock floating on a pond or a lake is not a miracle.
Because it simply doesn't fit the definition of a miracle. Remember, our working definition here is a surprising and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is therefore considered to be the work of a divine agency. First off, you can't just assume that it's the work of a divine agency until you can prove that divine agencies exist. I really want it to be true doesn't matter. The divine isn't a rational explanation without evidence that it actually exists first. And as we all know, there isn't any evidence for the divine. It's all just wishful thinking and blind faith. Anyone who wishes to disagree, pony up the demonstrable evidence and we'll talk. Now, it could very well be that we're just talking past each other and that he means something else when he says miracle. I don't know. I can only go by the words that come out of his mouth. However, I see no reason whatsoever to take miracle claims seriously if you can't even show that a real existing God is responsible, which is why I am very unlikely to be convinced by any of this. It all comes down to word games, and those don't impress me. He might be going somewhere else with this, though, so let's get back and see.
Because it lacks an explanatory framework to give it the sign, a semeion, a message of God's purpose, of God's power, of God's action.
None of which is reasonable without proof that a God exists first. This is why you can't start with an emotionally comforting conclusion before you have the evidence to get there rationally. I really like the idea. That means nothing. This is really where I think the religious and non-religious alike fail to cross paths because one is being emotional and the other is being rational. Mostly, at least on the non-religious side, because there are plenty who are utterly irrational on non-religious topics. It doesn't matter what appeals to you. It matters what is actually true in the real world, and this goes for everyone, everywhere, all the time. If you're just being emotional, then you've missed the logic train and you're just standing there being dumb. Don't do that. It doesn't help.
It lacks that additional context. So let me change and add the story and add a few things to give it that additional context to make it a candidate miracle.
Now, I know that Randal is doing this as an example, but haven't we seen this exact same thing from other apologists who do it for real? They just invent stories out of whole cloth that they know will appeal to their followers, and they're free to modify the tall tale at will to make it more effective, because they don't care if any of it is the truth. Yet, isn't the truth all that really matters? Not to the religious. They're mostly in it for the comfort. The clergy, including apologists, are in it for the money and the power and the control. Some might be clueless and really believe it, but I think that the higher that you get in the pecking order, the less that you care about the claims and the more you care about the benefits. But even if you do believe it, that doesn't mean anything if what you believe isn't actually true. How do you determine what is true? By testing it, by evaluating the evidence. If you're not doing that, or you can't do that, then you are doing rationality wrong. So stop it. It just makes you look dumb.
Let's say that the story goes like this. You're studying at college and you're really wrestling with faith, with whether to be a Christian or not.
And this is why you don't rely on faith. Faith means nothing. I get that the religious hate this, but too bad. Faith is not a demonstrable path to truth. That's why you need evidence. That's why you need rationality and reason. Faith is a complete waste of time. What you wish was true means nothing if it's not actually true. And the second you say that to a religious person, chances are they're going to run, throwing insults and empty threats behind them. Why? Because they have nothing else. The second that you show that you are not interested in their faith, they've got no reason whatsoever to talk to you at all. So they exit stage left as fast as they possibly can. Because these are not people who care one bit about reality. And that's pathetic.
And so you're living in London at the time, and you buy a copy of Mere Christianity, let's say.
Why? It's a crap book written by a hack apologist that's utterly laughable. Now, my distaste for C.S. Lewis is well known, but he really is one of the least impressive apologists out there, at least from a critical thinking standpoint. He's just pandering to the overly emotional and delusional idiots in the pews. It's little more than, wouldn't you really like this to be true? Nope. I don't care what I wish was true. I care what is defensibly true. And you've got nothing like that. And the religious don't know how to deal with that, so they just tend to run away. I just had another one do it a day or two ago where I was debunking everything that they had to say, and eventually they said, well, I can't learn anything from you because you don't respect my faith, so I'm leaving. Yeah, that's a big surprise, right? The second that someone points out how weak the foundation for their beliefs are, they just hoof it for the exit. Because what else can they do? They can't rationally evaluate their own beliefs, and they certainly can't defend them in a way that anyone with a brain will accept. So into the foothills they go. Because these people are just not that bright.
And you read it, and that copy of Mere Christianity has a transformative impact on you.
But that doesn't make it true. This is, once again, just an appeal to emotion. But it makes me feel good. Yeah, that doesn't mean anything, does it? There are all kinds of books out there, religious and non-religious alike, that have transformed lives. But that doesn't mean anything, though, does it? I know people whose lives were changed by reading Dune. That doesn't make sandworms real. So we're right back to square one, with one side caring about the real world and the other side just running away, terrified of it. Which side do you want to live on? Because I know my answer. What's yours?
And you write on the inside cover, it's all true, praise God. And then you sign your name.
That doesn't make it all true, though. It doesn't make praising God worthwhile. That's just an emotional reaction to something that isn't demonstrably so. So what's the point? Because these are questions that you really ought to be asking yourself, but the religious never do. So long as they get that dopamine shot in the head, they're good. But they're not. They're dumb. Because signing your name in a book, and we know where this is going, don't we? But that doesn't make it objectively true. It's the truth that matters. And Randal, as much as I appreciate him most of the time, he has none. So can we please stop saying ridiculous things? Because that would sure be nice.
And then you go on with your life and you eventually get rid of the book. You begin to have doubts, questions. Eventually, in your late 20s, you reject Christianity and become a skeptic. 30 years later, you're in Indiana. So you've been a skeptic now for close to 3 decades. And you're really wrestling because you have a recent cancer diagnosis.
Which means nothing. This isn't going to get him to God done it any more than the last two examples. If you find the book again, that doesn't mean that God done it. And no matter how many convenient details you throw into your made-up story, that's not going to change the truth. It's not going to make it a miracle. It's the same seeming coincidence now that it was before. No gods required. So let's just finish up his example and give up for a week, because this hasn't been remotely impressive. I just really like the idea. We'll never get you there, because ideas are not truth, and the truth is all that matters. This is why the religious never get anywhere with skeptics, because they're too busy assuming that everyone is just like they are. Weak-willed, weak-minded, emotionally desperate to get to childish comfort just for the sake of comfort, and we're not like that. I thought Randal was better than that, but I don't know, maybe he's just having an off day, but he really ought to know better than this. Granted, he's still not talking to us, is he? He's talking to his meal ticket. He's talking to the people who really want to believe and aren't going to be asking any of the serious questions that need to be asked, because he doesn't really want those answers. He just wants comfort, and that's ridiculous. Be better, Randal, because this is not impressing anyone with a brain.
And you're wrestling with your mortality, and you're questioning, what if God does exist? What if I'm wrong about all of this? You walk into that Indiana bookstore and you think, God, if you are there, give me a sign.
Give us some sort of sign.
But see, you're doing exactly what I said you were going to do. Here's a guy in a vulnerable state. He finds a coincidence and suddenly says, this means something, when it actually doesn't. If he found the book on a day that he wasn't doubting his faith, or he wasn't looking for answers, his reaction would have been, hey, that was kind of weird, because that's all it is. It only has meaning in the interpretation, and the interpretation doesn't mean anything. Facts, yes. Feelings, no. Learn to deal.
And lo and behold, you look and you see a copy of Mere Christianity just like the one you had 30 plus years before. And you grab it off the shelf. How amazing. In fact, you can see it's a British edition of Mere Christianity, which is even more amazing. It's got the uh, pence and pounds sign on the back, so you can tell it's British. You're like, this is amazing. You open up the cover, and with shock, you realize it's the exact same book with the inscription you wrote 30 plus years before saying it's all true.
All right, that's where we're going to stop for the week. The next video, I figure, is going to be reasonably short because we've only got 2 minutes of his content left because I just let this run on for a little bit too long. Sorry about that. But as I've already said, it means nothing more than either of the other two stories, and your interpretations don't make it a miracle. Unless you've neutered miracles so badly that they have no meaning whatsoever. If God didn't do it, then it's not a miracle. Just saying, hey, this means something to me, doesn't mean anything. That's just pure desperation because lots of theists are attached to the idea of miracles. They just know they can never prove miracles, so they just see miracles in the most mundane things because that gets them where they want to go. But that doesn't mean anything. This is still just a coincidence that you're wrapping up in meaning because you really like the idea. And that doesn't make it mean something. Honestly, I expected better from Randal than this. Granted, as I said, he's not talking to rational people. It's sometimes easy to forget that for all of the good things, or at least promising things that he says, he's still a theist, and therefore kind of clueless. Hopefully, he'll get better over time. Anyhow, what did you think of this so far? Like I said, the next one will probably be reasonably short, so maybe I'll do something with it. I don't know yet. That said, though, what do you think of miracle claims? Are you as entirely unimpressed by them as I am? Let me know down in the comments. Souls and miracles are some of the least convincing claims that the religious make in a whole field of ridiculously unimpressive claims, at least as far as I'm concerned. Seriously, you people need to find evidence because nothing else is working, and soon you'll be alone just talking to yourselves. I think that'll be a pretty great day when it comes. How about you? Nothing really fails in religion like miracle claims do, at least once the skeptics sink their teeth into them. These things are simply not defensible because they have no evidence for anything. It seems to me is completely irrelevant. It matters only what you can prove. So why not try that? Today, we're going to finish up Randal Rauser's miracle video, and as I said last time, it's going to be somewhat shorter than normal because we let last week's video run on pretty long. Sorry about that. Considering that Randal's pretty much the only apologist I sort of respect, at least because I see him on the fast track towards atheism if he just keeps going the way that he is, I will have to say that this video didn't impress me at all. In fact, it really shows the problems with religious claims and why they fail to convince anyone with a skeptical bone in their body. I mean, beyond the fact that it is all just a thought experiment that isn't actually real and can't be independently investigated, it really doesn't do a whole lot, does it? But we see the religious telling a lot of tall tales, don't we? And that's to be expected. So let's get in there and wrap this up.
That now becomes not just like the random rock floating on a lake that you see, but it becomes something in context that is meaningful, like the man who says, I will give you a sign that I'm a prophet, and he throws a rock on the lake that floats. In this case, the sign is you had just asked, God, if you are there, give me a message, give me a sign. And within 15 minutes, you see that book that you had had that transformed your life 30 years plus years before with the inscription, it's all true. You find that same book in the bookstore.
So let me get this straight. You think coincidences are miracles? Are you nuts? Because we have to go back to what our definition of a miracle is. A miracle is a surprising and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is therefore considered to be the work of a divine agency. Yet there is nothing there that points to any divine agent. This is all just an argument from ignorance. It only works if you presuppose the existence of a God. But you have no evidence to back that up, so why in the world would you actually do that? In the case of the religious, it's because they just really want it to be true. But that's foolish, isn't it? What you wish was true doesn't make it true. And it's the actual truth of the matter that matters, at least to rational people. It's videos like this that remind us that Randal still has a long way to go before he becomes a truly rational, skeptical individual. And I really hope that happens, but after watching this, I don't really know. It doesn't matter what you want to believe. It matters if what you believe is actually true, and here he's got absolutely nothing. It's just more, well, it seems to me theology, where they take the stuff that comforts them emotionally and insist that that's really what's going on, because they care more about their feelings than they do about the facts. And I'm sorry, Randal, but that's just dumb.
Now, note that there were no violations of natural law here.
Which is part of the definition of miracle that we're going with. But that also poses a problem for the religious, because even if something happens that appears to violate natural law, that depends entirely on our understandings of natural law in the moment, doesn't it? Nobody pretends that we know everything right this second, because obviously we don't. We discover new things all the time. That means that any supposed miracle is only miraculous in the moment at which it appears to violate natural law. Tomorrow, we might discover that it doesn't. We learn new things every single day. So miracles, even with our given definition, they're not forever. There's always the possibility that we'll figure out that they weren't somewhere down the line. And that's a problem for the religious who are looking for things to be true forever and ever and always. But that's not our problem, is it? This is really why the definition that we're using, the most common definition that I found, really isn't adequate for the task, because it assumes that the divine potentially exists at all without any evidence in support. You can't just assert, God done it. You've got to be able to back that up, and the religious simply can't. God done it means no more than aliens done it. Both are empty claims until you can show that gods or aliens or whatever it is you're talking about are real and are actually responsible in some verifiable way. Until then, you've just got, we don't know, and this is emotionally uncomfortable for the religious and some non-religious people alike. Too bad. You don't even necessarily have a miracle. That's just an empty assertion that miracles happen at all. You certainly can't convincingly posit the cause of any of these supposed miraculous events because you've got nothing. So again, this is not convincing at all, Randal. You have to be able to do a whole lot better, and unfortunately, we all know you can't.
This is not an event that has no natural explanation. It's perfectly easy to explain it as simply natural events.
Then why do you feel the need to insert a god into it at all? Because you want to? That's not rational. This is why I keep saying that you have to keep an eye on the words that they're using, because they will constantly try to slip in their theology, and you simply can't let them do that. We have to insist on holding them to a much higher standard, because they will never voluntarily hold themselves to it on their own. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It matters what is actually true, what is demonstrably true. what you have evidence to prove is true. And they have none of that, do they? It's why you have to be willing to ask the hard questions, and they simply will not have any worthwhile answers. Because they generally don't care, do they? Now, I'd like to think that Randal is different. I might be wrong, and looking at this video, yeah, I'm thinking maybe I might be. But the religious mind poison is a really hard thing to get rid of, no matter how hard you try. You have to get so comfortable asking the hard questions and expecting rational answers. And the religious, even recently deconverted atheists, they tend to have a really hard time doing that. Skepticism is absolutely essential, and it has to be applied evenly and consistently to positively everything. Your feelings just don't matter. And that's where the religious tend to go wrong.
You know, that the book, you got rid of it at a used bookstore in London 30 some years before, and maybe somebody bought it and then they came over and ended up in Indiana and then they got rid of their books and you just happened to walk in and see that book on that afternoon.
Yep, it could have happened that way. Or maybe someone has been stalking you for decades, and when you sold that book, they went in, they bought it, and they've been carrying it around with them for the last 37 years until they saw you coming into a store in Indiana, they followed you in, and they slipped it onto the shelf without you ever seeing them. Hell, maybe they've been doing this forever, and you just didn't stumble across the book before. They took it back, looked for the next opportunity, over and over and over again. That is a much more rational explanation than God done it. Now, that's still kind of a stupid explanation, because who the hell would do that? But the only answer that we're likely to come up with for any of this is, we don't know, and we need to learn to deal with that. At no time is it ever rational to assume an undemonstrated invisible man in the sky was responsible until you have the evidence that said invisible man in the sky is real and actually did the thing in question. If you can't reach that point, then God is never going to be a rational candidate explanation, and that is something that the religious just don't like. Well, too fucking bad.
Perfectly explicable in terms of chance. No need to invoke a divine causal agent to explain it.
Then why are you doing so? That's the question that you really have to ask. Why in the world are you tacking God done it onto a perfectly natural event, even if it is hard to wrap your head around? Because you could also say, aliens done it. For all you know, aliens found that book, replicated it identically thousands of times, and slipped it into every used bookstore on the planet. It wasn't so that you could find it. They have their own inscrutable reasons, but you just so happen to come across one by chance. Aliens are a better, more rational explanation than God any day of the week because they are natural. Now, you shouldn't believe that at all without corroboratory evidence, but it is a better explanation than God done it. You shouldn't believe that, or the stalker, or anything else without evidence. You sure the hell shouldn't believe in a God. It's just something for which we have no current rational explanation, and thus the only thing that you can say is, I don't know. Learn to deal. It's honestly not that hard.
The issue is not that it has no natural causal explanation. The issue is the context.
No, it's not. See, you're looking for meaning, but you can demonstrate no meaning whatsoever. This is the heart of, it seems to me, theology. You are looking for something that you can make sense of in some emotionally comforting way, and that is completely irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the truth and how you reach it. And you are not reaching truth, you are reaching comfort. Well, the world doesn't owe you comfort, I'm sorry to tell you. You need to figure that out. Shit happens, and there you go. You can never reach a God without evidence for a God. Not, it sounds like God to me, but actual demonstrable verifiable evidence that a God Any God, not just the one that you happen to like, exists, and you are nowhere remotely close to doing anything like that. God is just the automatic explanation that Christians rely on when they can't easily solve a problem. But guess what? Allah is the automatic explanation that Muslims rely on when they can't easily solve a problem. And Krishna for the Hindus, and body thetans for the Scientologists. I could go on and on and on. None of them have any evidence whatsoever, and no option is more rational or defensible than any of the others. Because they're all just dumb. You really need to learn to be better than that, and the religious have no interest. And that's kind of a problem, wouldn't you say?
Which makes it meaningful, makes it a semayon or a sign for you of God's benevolent action.
That's just the bullshit that you're pulling out of your ass because you really want it to be true, though. This is why they can't convince atheists of anything, because they have nothing at all to present that anyone with a brain would take seriously. Theists, not just Christians, but all theists, they fundamentally lack a grasp on reality because they don't want one. The world is just too scary a place for them to live in. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, though. You have to learn to deal with the reality that you actually live in, and don't figure that your emotions mean a damn thing. And the religious have zero interest in that. That's why they all fail the way that they do. They are all making the exact same mistakes, and they couldn't care less. They are leaping to the things that make them happy without giving a shit if any of it is true. God done it is never going to be a credible explanation without evidence for a real existing God. Pointing that out to them is the fastest way to make them run away because they don't want to have to deal with that. They'd rather live in their comforting emotional bubble because the real world is beyond their ability to cope. And that's all they're doing. Coping. Sad, isn't it?
So my question for you, as I presented that case scenario, if that happened to you, you walked into that used bookstore, asked for a sign from the divine, and you saw that book 10, 15 minutes later on sitting on the shelf that you'd gotten rid of 30 plus years before.
I will let you finish that thought, but let me ask you this first. If the same thing happened to a Muslim, would that be evidence that Allah exists? Or if it had happened to a Hindu, would that make it more likely that Krishna was real? Because they tend to only look at things through their own particular religious lens. But virtually all religions claim miracles, right? So if this exact same thing had happened with a Hindu book, and the Hindu had written, "Krishna is real" inside the cover, would that convince Randal to start worshipping the Hindu pantheon? And the answer, of course, is no. He'd find a way to rationalize his way around it. It was the devil. The devil did it. Well, can't you just say that about any of these hypothetical events? This is all just bald rationalization. The God that you believe in for entirely emotional reasons must have been responsible because the idea makes you feel good to think so. But that doesn't make it true. These are just stories that you tell yourself that don't demonstrably mean anything. Because, let's be honest, you really don't care. You just really want to believe. And that's still dumb.
Would that move the needle in your skepticism? Would you become more open to Christianity? Would you perhaps even become persuaded that God exists or that Christianity is true?
Nope, not at all. Because I'd be asking all of the questions that I've been asking this entire time. Questions that you, Randal, apparently refuse to ask yourself. Because I don't care about feelings. I care about facts, and if you don't care about the facts, then it's you with the problem, not me. There is a fundamental flaw in your epistemology that needs to be addressed. So address it. He won't, though, at least not now, because he really wants his religion to be true. Desire doesn't make truth, though, and truth is the only thing that matters. It just makes delusion, and delusion is all the religious are running on. You need to be able to deal with the reality in which you live, and the reality in which you live is not made for you. It's not here to make you happy. You need to figure out the truth and how you fit into it. But the religious just don't care. They are only after comfort, and if they have to lie to themselves and others to get there, hey, they'll do that in a heartbeat. I can imagine nothing so pathetic as that.
Give me your answers in the comments below.
I'm giving it to you in a video series. I have no idea if I'll go over and post links once this finally comes out, because that's going to be months after the fact, and he probably no longer cares. That's kind of the problem with the production schedule that I have. It's why I generally don't go back to the videos that I've done and post links. But, you know, you could do that if you really wanted to. I probably wouldn't argue if you wanted to do that. But, you know, I don't really do that. YouTube used to automatically do that, but they don't do that anymore. And that's a little stupid too. If you'd like to go around and post links back to all the videos that I've done, please feel free. I'm certainly not going to tell you what to do, but I probably wouldn't be opposed. At the end of the day, you do you. It might be interesting to see which apologists just delete the links and which ones let them stand. I don't know. I'm just rambling now because this whole thing was kind of dumb. I'll just knock it off. Anyway, what did you think of Randal's miracle claim, or his story, since it wasn't really a claim, it was just something he made up? Would that convince you? Let me know down in the comments, because it certainly did nothing to move the needle for me. You can't just start with a belief and say, it's just got to be that, because it strokes your ego to think so, and that's really all the religious are doing, aren't they? They can't ask the basic questions that really need to be asked because they don't care about the actual truth. In fact, I'd say they're terrified of it. And that's not really a good thing, is it? Sorry again for the somewhat shorter video, but the SUPERCUT fans will be happy in the end. So take care, don't fall for any of these stupid claims, and I'll catch you all next time.